Good morning and welcome to this Knox College Alumni Seminar. This morning's topic is Local Ecumenism, a Faithful Opportunity, presented by Dr. Sandra Beardsall. This seminar is part of a series offered by Knox College in response to requests from alumni. You can find more information about upcoming seminars at the link you'll see appearing in the chat. My name is Duncan Jeffrey, and this year I'm president of the Knox Ewart Graduates Association. I'm recently retired from ministry at Richmond Hill, and I will be your moderator for this event. We're glad you're here, and we look forward to learning together. A few logistical items. This seminar is being recorded, and you'll receive access to the recording via email after the seminar. Following Dr. Beardsall's presentation, we'll have time for questions. Please use the Q&A section of the chat to type your questions. We wish to acknowledge the land on which Knox College operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Our presenter today, Sandra Beardsall, is Professor Emerita of Church History and Ecumenics and an ordained minister in the United Church of Canada. Originally from Brampton, Ontario, she received her MDiv and THD at the Toronto School of Theology. She served congregations in Newfoundland, Labrador, and Eastern Ontario, including a shared United Anglican congregation before beginning a 24-year career at St. Andrew's College in Saskatoon, with a focus on Canadian church history, studying fictional representations of parish life and ecumenical movements. She co-wrote the book Daring to Share, Multi-Denominational Congregations in the United States and Canada, and currently serves on the Commission on Faith and Order of the World Council of Churches. Sandra, good morning, welcome. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Duncan. It's a privilege and an honor to be with you. Thank you to you for your gracious words of welcome. Thank you to Stephanie behind the scenes, who's moving along our tech for us, and to Jenna Lee and those at Knox who put these wonderful seminars together. I'm delighted to be joining you from Saskatoon, which is on Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis people. And I'm happy to share with you some reflections on a topic that I think has both practical, pastoral and theological resonance. And so I look forward to some time with you today. I'm going to say a little bit about my own experience that drew me into ecumenical shared ministries, then introduce you to some and talk about how we get started doing such things, weaving in some theology along the way, and then how ecumenical shared ministry might be significant for us in our lives and our ministries. And finally, we will have some time for that Q&A, in the hope that I know that some of you may have experience in these kinds of ministries, that maybe you can share some of that in Q&A, or otherwise we can engage with each other. So next slide, please, Stephanie. Thank you. So finding a treasure. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, which someone found and hid. Then in his joy, he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Well, I found a treasure hidden, not so much in a field, but in a lake, in Blueberry Lake, and that's the photo of it there, in central Labrador. While I was serving a pastoral charge in southern Labrador on the coast of Labrador, a charge of the United Church of Canada, I had to go to a presbytery meeting, and in those days, to get to the Labrador Presbytery, one had to take 2 flights from Red Bay, where I lived, to get to, and a very long drive, to get to Churchill Falls, where presbytery was being held. When I got there, I found this treasure. It's called the Churchill Falls Community Church is the name of the building. And within that building are 2 congregations, St. Peter's Roman Catholic and St. Mark's Anglican United Church. And I was so taken with the wonder of churches sharing together in that way that I became passionate about wanting to be part of shared ministry. And a few years later, my dream came true when I received a call to serve St. Mark's Anglican United Church congregation in Churchill Falls. And so I got to experience firsthand what a treasure I think I found in the sharing of Christians together in daily life, in worship, in ministry together. So that's what got me started. And now now I'd like to tell you a little bit about what that's all about. So next slide, please. Ecumenical shared ministries, and in Canada we fortunately have a little shorthand, ESMs, and when we say those words in mainline Protestant denominations particularly, everybody knows, well, many people know what we're talking about. ESM, ecumenical shared ministry. What are they? Next, please. So an ecumenical shared ministry, we have agreed in Canada, is defined as people worshiping and serving God in a unified way while still maintaining their denominational identity and connections. And that comes out of a handbook I'll introduce a little later called the ESM handbook. It's an important definition because it means that we're not simply merging together to become a community church with no identifiable denominational connections, but we stay grounded in our denominational links and identities as we share important aspects of ministry. Next, please. So what do they share? Well, any 2 of, or at least one of, any two denominations sharing at least one of a building, worship together, ministry personnel, a program, outreach, and sometimes all of those things. The one that I served shared every one of those things, and many across Canada, probably the majority who have formal shared ministries, share all of those things. But it can be any of those that become an ecumenical sharing. Next, please. So how do they do that? Well, they operate within a covenant agreement that they've shaped under the oversight of their denominational adjudicatories or adjudicatories, depending on how you're feeling about them. Adjudicatories is the kind of overarching term we've come up with to describe the people that make decisions at kind of regional and other levels, levels beyond the pastoral charge or congregation. And so that can be a diocese, especially for Anglicans and Roman Catholics. That can be presbytery for Presbyterians. That's a region for United Church folks, and a synod for Lutherans, just as an example. Next, please. And so who does this? Well, it's always hard to tell exactly how many there are in Canada, and I just heard today of one from Duncan that there's one more sharing kind of in the offing between a United Church and a Presbyterian congregation in Southern Ontario. But about 111 congregations or or pastoral charges share together, and you can see the percentages of sharing. So the Anglican Church is involved in the majority of shared ministries, partly because of a long-standing relationship with the United Church in shared ministry that goes back to the 1960s. But then also their full communion agreement with the Evangelical Lutheran Church, which has facilitated an ease of sharing across Anglican Lutheran lines. The United Church comes next, closely followed by the Evangelical Lutherans. At about 56% of shared ministries include United Church and partners, and likewise Lutheran partners. And Presbyterians hold their own at 14%. There are 7 with Roman Catholic sharing, largely the sharing of buildings, but I'll tell you about a couple of others that go a little further. And then there are 2 that include Disciples of Christ partners, 2 that include Mennonite Church Canada partners, 1 with a Moravian Church partner, and at least 1 with Baptist partner, although I believe that some of those, there are others developing in Maritime Canada. And you see the picture on the left there. Chetwynd, BC has a long-standing shared ministry going back at least 50 years. Anglican, Lutheran, Presbyterian, and United, 4 ways. We call those kinds of shared ministries, because there are a few of them around, Paul ministries, for the PAUL denominations that share together. So that's just a kind of a snapshot of who's sharing in Canada. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to introduce you to just 3 shared ministries in a little bit of depth. My challenge is that I could talk about the congregations that I've been able to meet and the people that I've shared in ministry with over the years way too long. So I'll try not to overwhelm you with these stories. But the Pinawa Christian Fellowship seems like a good one to share with you. It was founded in 1963, so it's 60 years old this year. And in its earliest days, it included Anglican, Baptist, Lutheran, Mennonite, Presbyterian, and United Church partners all together. So 6 together. Well, Pinawa is in Manitoba. But it is a company town founded by Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, and the people that populated Pinawa all came from Chalk River initially. In the initial days, all came from Chalk River, Ontario, where they had experienced a shared ministry at Deep River together. And so they were determined that their church would be one of sharing again. Certainly that the Protestants were going to work together as best they could to share ministry together, and they did. Now, what happened over time, in the late 1960s, the Lutherans decided to build their own church building because they felt that they had enough parishioners that they wanted to go on their own. Although now they're back to more conversation about sharing again, and they do share their summer services together with the rest of the Pinawa Fellowship. The Baptists didn't leave out of any particular reason, except that their numbers dwindled to some extent. And so there are still Baptists involved in this fellowship, but they don't have a formal relationship with the Baptist, with a Baptist denominational organization. So they're now formally Anglican, Mennonite, Presbyterian, and United. And as you see, or as you can imagine, you can see their church looks a little different. They worship in a local school. They made a commitment early on that they would not press to build a church, that they would focus on funding their ministry. And you can see that they've created a beautiful space for their worship every Sunday. There have been talks over time about building a church together with the Catholics, but uncertainty about the future of the community means that they have been like many Christians over many centuries, and people of faith before that, pilgrims on a journey who see themselves sharing in a space that makes it viable for them. And so that, I think, is a significant thing. They had a long time minister, Robert Murray, who some of you might know in Presbyterian circles, who served there for over 20 years, but left in 2022, I think. Next slide, please. So here's another one that I think has an interesting story to share. I should say that probably the majority of shared ministries occur in rural or small town communities, but by no means all of them. So you don't have to be any particular kind or shape or size of community to think about shared ministry. And this one has a particularly interesting story for me as a United Church person, sharing with folks who are probably, a number of you are indeed Presbyterians. Well, it goes back to 1925, and that was the time that that Christians in Canada were voting on church union, Methodist, Presbyterian, Congregationalists especially. And the congregation at Deer Park Presbyterian, the majority chose to join the church union that would form the United Church of Canada, but a significant minority did not want to join union, and they left the church and they went around the corner and they founded Calvin Presbyterian. And so the two churches in uptown Toronto, beautiful, big, majestic churches, served around the corner from one another and cooperated on some things over the years. But then something happened at Deer Park United, and that was that they had conveniently been able to lease a part of their land to an oil company who decided in the early 2000s to move to Calgary. And the problem with that was not only the loss of the lease, but the fact that as part of the lease, the oil company gave them free oil to heat their very, very large church building. And so the congregation could no longer sustain the building it was in. Well, the first thought was, well, amalgamate with another United Church. There are lots of them around. But they felt that they might lose their own identity in some way if they did that, and they wanted to kind of retain their Deer Park specialness. So then the congregation of Calvin said, well, maybe you'd like to come and share with us. And so a shared ministry developed, finalized in 2008, between the Calvin Presbyterians and the Deer Park United, and they began to share. They each have their own ministers. So you see there, Deborah Hart, a United Church minister, and Emily Bissett, the Presbyterian minister. But they do share worship and other resources and music, their beautiful music program together. And I like to point out the little taglines they each use for their own church denomination, for their own church congregation. Calvin says they are a vibrant, ecumenical, and reformed community of faith in the heart of Toronto. And Deer Park says, in God's hands, praying, thinking, working together. So each of them in their way speaks to their distinctiveness, but also their sharing. And I find that a powerful and helpful witness. And you see, they still retain two names. Often the shared ministries merge and become one thing. But sometimes they like to retain their two congregational identity names, as well as some of their identity of some of their functions, of course, too. So that's just another example of a shared ministry. And just to tell you how special I think this church was as they formed and created their ministry together. I'm going to read you a little bit out of the book that was mentioned that I wrote with some colleagues, American colleagues, but from an interview that I had with Marie Goodyear, who was the United Church minister at the time of the covenanting. She talked about leaving Deer Park United Church. We had a short desanctification service. The big farewell had been the week before. Then we walked down St. Clair Avenue in Toronto and up to Calvin, led by three people, one carrying the cross from the communion table, one carrying the chalice, and one carrying the Christ candle. The rest of us followed behind. We had a little service at the Calvin doorway and knocked on the door. They opened the door and we walked in. The Calvin people were there. They were singing a hymn, But rather than facing the front, they had turned to face us as they sang. Also, they were standing off to the side of the center aisle so that we could go into the pews without climbing over anyone. It was the most incredibly welcoming way of doing it. And I think a kind of beautiful model of what that sharing could be, and how people, although they had to leave their building, were welcomed warmly into a new space. So next slide, please. So the final one that I'll introduce to you before saying a little more about shared ministries generally is Broadway Disciples United in Winnipeg. And again, it has a kind of interesting backstory, and that's partly why I'd like to share it with you. Now, the Disciples of Christ are a very small denomination globally and certainly in Canada, but they have an ecumenical vocation. They are deeply, deeply committed to the unity of the body of Christ. And so in Winnipeg, they were a fairly small but robust congregation that felt like they'd outgrown the little church that they were worshiping in. Most of the members of that congregation were had originated in the Philippines, and so were Filipino first or second generation Canadians, and they wondered about, was there any way that they could have a bigger presence in the city of Winnipeg? Well, they saw a for sale sign on a downtown church, Broadway Avenue United, which had been a majestic church in its day and was still a big building right across the road from the legislature in Winnipeg. So a prominent location, but the congregation had aged and dwindled, and they had decided to close. So the people from the disciples congregation knocked on the door, or gave a phone call to the presbytery. Then the United Church had presbyteries, and asked, what about this church? And they said, well, they're not interested in anything but closing. They're for sale. Can't you just let them kind of be? They're tired, they're old. And they said, well, we can't afford to buy it, but like, what if we offer you $1? Will you talk to us? And so they said, oh, all right. And so the United Church, with another United Church that was also a very small Filipino-based congregation, plus the Disciples congregation, started talking. And then they said, well, let's maybe do a service together. And they decided, well, let's do Palm Sunday and see what happens. And they created this Palm Sunday liturgy that just had them all weeping and blown away by the beauty of it all. And they marched around with their palms, and they just said, we can't bear to be apart anymore. And so they became Broadway Disciples United Church in 1997. And with this interesting Filipino and Anglo-Canadian congregation, where most of the United Church members from Broadway were older folks, mostly Anglo-Canadian. And the Filipinos tended to be younger and have young families, and they'd left grandparents behind in the Philippines. And wonderful informal relationships developed, where some of the Broadway folks kind of adopted the disciples, young people, as their grandchildren in faith. And so those two congregations found a new way to thrive as a shared ministry in Winnipeg. Well, okay, I'll turn now to the next slide, and we'll look at the factors that people say brought them into sharing. And I did a survey a number of years ago where I asked every shared ministry that I could find in Canada, asked them to tell me, rank from extremely important to not at all important, what caused them to enter into sharing together. And the top 4 things, if you put extreme, if you give sort of a ranking to extreme and very or considerably important, you get these rankings. And at the very top, practical and financial necessity, 100%. Nobody said that wasn't part of the equation. But look what was close behind, and that was the desire to provide a more unified witness in the community. And now, especially in small communities, this can be really significant. It doesn't just mean that people see, oh, good, the Christians have finally learned to cooperate with each other, but it gives a kind of it gives a sense that this church belongs here in this community, and we've made it work here, because so often amalgamations within a denomination take the church out of the church congregation, out of the community, to amalgamate elsewhere. And so that unified witness was really important to most people that got involved in shared ministry. And then close behind that, the desire to be together and know one another better as Christians. So you see that it begins with very practical reasons, but there's also this embedded desire to be together with people that, again, in smaller communities, we're together with every other day of the week in other contexts, in the hockey rink, in the curling club, in the school work we do. So why wouldn't we want to know each other as Christians as well? And then, still significant at 75%, the opportunity to share programs like Sunday school and youth group. These are and sometimes that's all that gets shared in some contexts, but even that is significant and helpful to congregational life. So those were the main reasons that people shared. Next slide. So, but okay, so those are the why they shared, or told us why they shared. What might be the theology that lies behind this? Next, please. Well, this is a quote from the Reverend Claire Holmes, who was a United Church minister in an Anglican United Church shared ministry that shared a building with the Roman Catholic Church in northern Vancouver Island, in one of those very early sharing opportunities that started in the 1960s and 70s. I should say that British Columbia was kind of the was the epicenter of Anglican United, with some Catholic sharing in Canada in the 1960s and early 70s. They had a bishop who was deeply committed to ecumenism, and there was the hope that there might be a full organic union between those churches, along with the disciples of Christ at the time. Anyway, Claire Holmes was a kind of pioneer for shared ministries, and he said in an interview, "The thing that always annoys me is that people say, 'Oh, you just want me to get into it for the economics.'" But there is a text, I think, he goes on to say, a text about that, to be blessed and poor. I think it is neat that we did, in fact, need each other. Maybe we are rich because we needed each other. So often people want to kind of undermine shared ministry as a kind of pragmatic solution that doesn't do the theology it should. But I like to think of it as not as a solution that replaces a theology of scarcity with a theology of abundance, and says we together can be rich. And I thought that quote of Claire Holmes was beautiful to express that. Next, please. Yeah. And then this is from an international ecumenical document. Some of you may have seen the Church Towards a Common Vision that came out 10 years ago, inviting the churches to see across the board and across the world the ways that we have developed ecumenically and towards a unified witness and a unified and closer Christian unity. And then, so that was sent out for responses. And when the responses came in, the Commission on Faith and Order, on which I serve, some folks on that reviewed the responses. And one of the things they found is this, what I quote here. They say, "There is a sense of not waiting for official ecumenical achievements, but rather a determination to act together locally and to receive the gift of unity in anticipation." And I think that's a great way to look at what ecumenical shared ministries do. They receive the gift that's already there. Jesus said, "You all belong to me." And they receive that in their own context, not because their national churches have got it all together to do that nationally, but because they anticipate that that's what the fullness of unity in the body of Christ will look like. And so there's a kind of theology not only of abundance, but also a theology of eschaton, of anticipation, in coming together and working out something that isn't quite there yet, but we know is coming, and we believe to be the will of Christ for Christ's church. Next, please. So, well, how do you do all this? And it can seem kind of overwhelming to think about all the things that might be involved. So there are some first steps. So next, please. First, you interrogate your own needs for ministry. And often this comes because something's happened and you realize, or you see something on the horizon. We're not going to be able to carry on this ministry if we don't do something. So you're already probably thinking about that in many places. What does your parish or community of faith need? What do they need to thrive? What would help them? What does your wider community need? What kind of witness, ministry, and mission do you believe you're called to do? Next, please. And then, so as you think about that, you say, well, who are your natural ecumenical partners or friends in ministry? Who are the people around you ecumenically who might be closer than anybody in your denomination in terms of geographic location? Who might they be, and how might you work with them? Next. So invite them to join the discussion with you. They might have to have some discussion on their own as well as discussion with you. Next. And then amongst you, you don't need to start with the full-blown shared ministry, share everything. You say, well, what are some of the needs that we're dealing with here? Maybe we can't afford our building anymore and we need to sell it or leave it for some reason. Maybe we lack a minister, and we need a minister, but we can't afford a minister. And maybe if we share with others, we can afford to share ministry personnel with one another. Maybe it's more an outreach project or something that we're involved with, and we need to work with more people. We need to do it together. Is there something that we could do a lot better if we do it together? Our vacation summer Bible schools or other activities that we know might work better together. Many places, I know certainly in rural Canada, already share particular church dinners, suppers together, and then portion them throughout the year to each denomination. So that's a great start. And what else can you do that would be better by sharing? And don't be intimidated by these ones I've introduced to you that are full-blown sharing partners, because most ecumenical shared ministries do start small. They say, could we work on this in a small way? Often they find that quite rapidly that expands, but don't be intimidated, I guess would be my line there. Next, please. So you do some things together, and you see what works. And so that example of the Disciples United folks saying, well, we'll do one service together. And now that one was a particularly upending sort of service that they did. But try some things. You maybe already do summer worship together or other things, or Good Friday, or some special things that you do at certain times. Do some things and see how it works. Visit each other's churches. See what it's like to go to somebody else, even if some of your elders go just to another church and experience that together. Next, please. And then you say, are there others who might want to come on board? And sometimes that happens. You find out that there's someone else in your community, maybe someone you didn't expect. In Western Canada, some Alliance churches, some Baptist churches are starting to warm to the idea of working together with the mainline churches. And there's often a readiness among Roman Catholics, at least to share in building and projects together. Next, please. Then what? Well, then next, please. You include those adjudicatories in your discussion. So those are your bishops, the diocesan personnel if you're Anglican, the synod if you're Lutheran, the region if you're United Church, presbytery staff if you are Presbyterian. And in the picture here, you see Andrea Brennan, who's an Anglican minister, with Kathy Davies, who's who represents the region of the Pacific Mountain region of the United Church, and then Lynn McNaughton, who's the Archbishop of British Columbia and the Yukon, and they are the adjudicatories that oversaw and continue to oversee a new ecumenical shared ministry that came about in the midst of the pandemic in Fernie, British Columbia. They talked about it before the pandemic, and they got it started, and then so actually I guess they started just before the pandemic. They got it started, and then during the pandemic they realized how much they needed each other, and so they moved from sharing some things together, sharing the minister and some of her functions together, to worshiping together every Sunday. Next, please. So why do you have to involve these adjudicatories? Well, their support is necessary for smooth transitions and for ongoing support. And these covenants are signed by our denominational adjudicatories. And so they give us a certain sense of they give us some confidence that we're not just ad hoc getting together and everything could blow up any minute. They give us something that we know we can count on. And the adjudicatories being involved make sure that they agree that we've done the right thing by that. Next, please. So how do you find it all out? Well, there's a document called the Ecumenical Shared Ministries Handbook, and it's free. It's a PDF document. That will be sent to each person who registered. Stephanie will make sure that it's sent to each person who registered for this webinar, as will, I should say, the PDF of the slides of this webinar as well. So I know you'll have the video, but you'll also have the slides if you'd like to use those in any way. And this handbook walks through all the processes for formation, for clergy appointments, governance, finances, and property. And so the basics, it tells you, it's about the nuts and bolts, and it kind of tells you what things you need to attend to and how that might look and how you might make that work. It comes with a handy glossary of terms, which people use in ecumenical settings, even outside of shared ministry congregations, because they're so useful. I mean, who outside of the Presbyterian Church knows what a standing order of presbytery really is? And does anyone other than an Anglican think a primate is anything but a primate who swings from a tree? And so those are the kinds of things that are covered there. And mentioning local sharing, I should mention that I'm prioritizing here shared ministries in local congregations. But not discounting the many shared ministries that happen in institutional settings, prisons and schools, university chaplaincies, and other kinds of sharing. So not to discount that, but just to focus today on local congregational type sharing. Anyway, this handbook is very useful and walks you through what you need to know. Next slide, please. So it includes those things I mentioned: property and assets, membership, how you define that, what your governing structure is going to look like. Usually it's an overarching board for the shared ministry, and then denominational decision-making bodies, because you still have to make decisions that your denomination asks of you. Pastoral leadership, how are clergy going to be appointed? Which processes will you use? Worship, how and who decides? We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Financial support, where does it come from and how do we assess it? How denominational records will be kept. How will we handle conflict management? Most of our denominations have processes. Will we choose one of those to use? What would an opting out clause look like? It's never fun in a prenup, as we like to maybe call this, to think about having to think about leaving each other. But just knowing that you have some process for following to follow in order to do that if necessary is helpful. How will we orient ourselves and then anybody who comes in to what we're doing in this ministry? So do we have a little booklet or handbook that we'd like to share with people about what we do here, that because people may be confused by it? And how and when will you review the ministry agreement? It's good to set a timeline, and then people who are feeling awkward about the sharing can say, well, we know it's going to be reviewed. We'll see how it's going. And then once again, remember that you can start small with this. So all of those things are in this handbook. Next slide, please. So I said worship is something that needs to be sorted. And how do they tend to worship? Well, really, there are two options, and they both are in effect in Canadian ecumenical shared ministries. Usually the starting point, and perhaps the most common, is that the participating denominations rotate their own liturgies in some sort of pattern. So that one Sunday it's the United Church and the next Sunday it's the Lutheran. In Slave Lake, Alberta, where there are Lutheran, Anglican, and United, first Sunday's Anglican, second Lutheran, third United, or some variation there. And then fourth Sunday, pastor's choice, that kind of rotation. So what happens there is that you don't get your own denomination's liturgy every Sunday, but you do get to participate in the life of the other congregation's liturgy, and they in yours. Sometimes there's a combined or ecumenical liturgy prepared specifically for that congregation, and that tends to happen when the ministry's been around for a while and people are comfortable worshiping together, and they say, we're finding these distinctions less and less easy to determine. And so they create a liturgy that they use at least some of the time. So a mixture sometimes of patterns. Once in a while, it's a kind of minister for hire situation where the minister does the liturgy of rotates, but the congregations don't. And that's sort of what was started in Fernie, when they rapidly realized they would prefer to worship all together in the same place together. Although in Fernie, I think they were sort of moved, they were only having one service each Sunday, but those things happen too. So what happens in that kind of context? Well, it's a bit of dislocation because you don't get your preferred worship order exactly as you've always had it every Sunday. But you get the gift of somebody else's worship. And so like learning somebody else's language, it can be tough and it can take time. But what people that are in shared ministries say is that they become kind of biliturgical, the way you might become bilingual. They learn to appreciate, they learn to love, they learn to look forward to the liturgy of the other, even if it's not the one that they have committed themselves to in the life of the church that they live in. And so that sense of biliturgical is an important piece of being in shared ministries, being bicultural in a way, sharing your church culture with another. I've put on the other side of the slide there the cover of a little booklet called The Port Alice Liturgy for an Ecumenical Service, arranged by the priests, ministers, and laity of the Roman Catholic, Anglican, United Churches, and United Churches of Port Alice, BC, for use on ecumenical occasions. And I've shared this because this is a Eucharist. This is a communion liturgy that was approved by the Roman Catholic Bishop of Victoria, Remy de Roux, the Anglican Bishop of Vancouver Island, which is called British Columbia in the diocese, and the United Church Presbytery that covered the northern part of Vancouver Island. They all agreed that this liturgy could be used together with all the people in one place and I think it was used as much as once a month at one time. It's still used for special occasions. It has to involve a celebrant from each denomination, and each celebrant has to consecrate their own elements. But the people all do it. The liturgy is one thing. The people do it together, and they're supposed to go to their own stations according to their denominations, but there's nobody actually policing that. And so this came about because there was so much cooperation between the Catholic Church and the Anglican United Church Ministry that all shared this one church together, that the adjudicatories said, we see the love that people have for each other. It's genuine. It's a community. How can we deny them the Eucharist together? So there are a few rare and special places where we even cross those kinds of boundaries in worship. Next slide, please. So I'll speak briefly, and then I do want to get to any of your questions and comments. There are some challenges: uneven denominational support. Some denominations in some areas are more supportive than others, and it varies across regions. The mutual recognition of ministries is challenging, particularly between Anglicans and those of us in non-Episcopal ordaining churches, so Presbyterian and United Churches. How are our ministries recognized in a shared ministry? Often it means that someone from the Anglican tradition still has to come in and conduct a Eucharistic service in their tradition, but they permit their members to go to Eucharist, to the communion table, if the presider is using their own tradition. But those kinds of things become stumbling blocks sometimes, along with issues of the ordination or being commissioned as a diaconal minister in the United Church. Geographical boundaries, of course, never overlap nicely between denominations and can be challenging. Adjudicatories and everyone else is all overworked. Everyone's tired. And so sometimes the thought of ecumenical sharing, rather than being seen as something at the heart of what all our ministries should be anyway, becomes something that seems tiresome and too much to consider. And of course, conflict emerges. And sometimes the conflict, as it does in all places, happens, but it sometimes gets pegged to the sharing, even if the sharing isn't the root cause of it. So those are things that have to be worked through. Next slide, please. And so how do we help each other on that journey? Next. Well, cultivating a climate of open and mutual respect, just making that part of who we are and who we guarantee to be for one another. Next. To think of it as something we are trying out, like it's an experiment. We're experimenting at being a faithful Christian community. We're living in that anticipation. And so we know some things might not work and we might have to tinker with it. And we'll give each other some license to make a mistake and carry on. So that idea that we're trying this for the sake of the gospel. Next, please. We already have ties in our communities. Let's strengthen those and let those become ways that we strengthen our partnerships, especially again in smaller communities where we do other things together. Next, please. And finally, back to my friend Claire Holmes, who talked about being rich because we need each other. he reminds us to remind ourselves that we are sharing our gifts. We're not competing to overtake each other. So in ecumenism, we talk about the ecumenical gift exchange, and we also talk about receptive ecumenism, knowing that we don't have it all, we lack in our Christian life because we are divided. What can I receive from another? What can I learn from you? And as Claire Holmes put it, I came to realize in shared ministry that that was such an important part of my Christian vocation. I am most anxious to have added to my life the richness of your ways. So reminding ourselves that that's at the heart of what we're doing together. Next, please. This is the last slide before Q&A. Every task in a shared ministry involves this other, right? Another, someone of another tradition, another denomination. And it means choosing the other over the urge to compete with or ignore the other, which we're really good at as Christians, competing and ignoring. It's making a different choice. Why do we do that? Well, if we think about grace, we realize that grace at heart is a dare that God takes in Jesus, daring to love us without reserve, daring to be human among us and to take us on without reserve. And so if the grace that we inherit is based on that kind of risk and dare that God takes for us, is sharing the journey together ecumenically a way to accept that dare and to live in that grace. And that's a way to help shared ministries thrive. And so there is one last slide that just says, so next, yes, your stories, your questions, and your concerns. I haven't been looking at the chat, but I know Duncan will help me see what's there and in the Q&A, and we can go from there.
We have one question from Paul Kang.
Okay.
How does a Presbyterian, Anglican, ESM approach the Eucharist given their different understandings in theology and in practice?
Good. Yeah, that's a good question, Paul. Yeah. And I mentioned it a little bit there that well, I was in a United Church Anglican ministry, so that's not a lot different theologically from Presbyterian when it comes especially to the Eucharist. First of all, we do have to remind ourselves that we share a lot about the Eucharist. And so when we look at what actually happens in the Eucharist, if you read the Church Towards a Common Vision or the older Baptism, Eucharist, and Ministry, we see that there isn't a lot that separates us in the Eucharist. And so generally Anglican bishops permit their people to attend the Eucharist of the Presbyterian or the United Church if they're in a shared ministry, and that's the service being offered. So if they have an Anglican, if they have a United Church or a Presbyterian minister, they can receive that Eucharist. The challenge becomes licensing the non-Anglican partner, and that doesn't happen very often. And so generally, if they want to have an Anglican rite Eucharist out of the Book of Alternative Services or the Book of Common Prayer, then an Anglican needs to come in and be a guest presider for the Eucharist. In terms of the actual theological differences, those don't seem to play a very big role, given that we tend to welcome each other to each other's tables in the Anglican, United, and Presbyterian churches. So so that's how they operate generally. I hope that answers it. If you can put in another question if I haven't. Yes. And Paul, do you want to, yeah, go ahead. Yes, thanks.
I'm looking at I don't have a question online right now, but I'm looking at those who are in attendance. Amongst them, a Barb Fotheringham from Pictou County, Nova Scotia. who served 6 years in UCC PCC shared ministry.
Great.
I'm wondering, is Barbara still with us? And would Barbara have anything to share or to ask about at this meeting?
That would be great to hear about, Barb. I have not visited. I haven't been to the Nova Scotia Shared Ministries, and that would be great if you wanted to share something. I guess in the chat with us about it, or in the Q&A, you could write something. That would be fabulous. Yeah. Yeah.
Meanwhile, Dr. Beardsall,
Yeah.
I recently became interim moderator of a Presbyterian church that sold its church and moved into a United Church building. Currently, we worship separately. They do at 9:30, we do at 11:30. The congregations have a long history of doing things together,
Okay.
Good Friday predominantly,
Right.
and many of them know each other outside the church.
Right.
So we've actually become an ESM without really knowing it. Where do we go next? Where do we go next?
Where do you go now? Well, yes, well, you are an ESM. That's great. Congratulations. I guess the issue is you might want to think about how you've covenanted what you do together, and it might be helpful so I don't know how much you've formalized it, but if you wanted to kind of frame it as a shared ministry, you can use like the Shared Ministries Handbook just to kind of say, this is who we are. We have a formal group that oversees our shared ministry. So we have a, we set a little board. We put together a little board or a little council that oversees the sharing. And although right now, it's sort of mainly sharing the building, it gives you that, if you have a covenant, then it gives you some options for looking further into ministry together without demanding anything at this moment of you more than the sharing you're doing. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense,
Okay.
Dr. Beardsall. Another question from Paul Kang: how do ESMs consisting of two different denominations remunerate a solo minister?
Yes. Well, that's why you have that. Yes, you have to work it out. It depends. Yeah. They sometimes, if they're about even in numbers, they each commit that they will share in they will share evenly in the remuneration. If it's a really small group and a larger group, then they maybe create a different proportion for them, which they say we'll update as we evaluate what our membership list looks like. So it's part of the sort of the laundry list of things that you need to work out when you're figuring out ministry. And of course, there are shared ministries, I shouldn't say this, but who say, okay, let's get the minister from the cheapest denomination. But generally, one of the challenges is to find clergy for shared ministries, partly because they're often in, more rural or isolated places, partly because there's a ministry shortage everywhere. And so there's, so it depends on it, but each shared ministry figures it out with their adjudicatories assisting them. And okay.
Thank you very much. We are drawing to the close of our time together. I just want to reach out to Barbara, right, who says, Kit Pastoral Charge in Quebec is the oldest shared ministry in the PCC, formed of the necessity of wanting to continue with English worship. But so far, I'm not finding Nova Scotia so open.
Right. Well, that's really exciting, Barbara. I'd say just keep at it and hang in there for the duration. Quebec is and Nova Scotia each have their special distinctives, don't they? And it probably just takes time to work those things through, and histories and understanding. There's a term called purification of memory, where we work through our histories, and are there painful things in our histories that are keeping us from wanting to work together, and that sort of thing. And yeah. And
well, thank you.
I see a note from Shirley and Bernie Karstad, and hello to them.
Yeah.
They're an interchurch couple, Catholic and Lutheran, who are deeply committed to ecumenical work, and I'm so glad that there with us today.
I'm grateful to you, Dr. Beardsall, for that very engaging presentation and very timely in my case.
Okay.
And thanks to all of you from across our country who've
Indeed.
been participating in the conversation today. We have several of these seminars scheduled for 2023, including Falling Faster, Generosity and the Future of the Church on February 23rd, Women, Gender and Genesis on March the 8th. We hope to see you there. And for now, blessings to each of you in your life and ministry.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.